The morning began like it always did on October 14th, quietly, deliberately, with the weight of memory pressing against the skyline of Los Angeles. The city itself seemed to slow down as if it too remembered. The sunlight struggled to break through a thin veil of coastal fog as the gates of Forest Lawn Memorial Park creaked open for another visitor. But this one had been here before. Jonathan Blackwell stepped out of his black Bentley with the kind of practiced composure that had defined him for decades. He adjusted the collar of his tailored wool coat, the fabric crisp against the morning, chill, and clutched a bouquet of white tulips, her favorite. His polished shoes crunched over the gravel path as he walked past rows of headstones toward the same quiet place he visited every year. It had been 5 years since he'd discovered Isabel Rivera's grave. 5 years since the woman who had once filled his world with light had revealed her final secret by dying in silence. And yet even now it didn't feel real, not entirely. Some part of him still expected to turn a corner, find her sitting beneath a tree with a sketchpad in her lap, ready to challenge him about something or laugh at his overly serious face. But the only thing that greeted him was stillness. Her headstone was modest. No grand declarations or ornate carvings. Just her name, her years, and a line she must have chosen herself. She loved in color. She lived in truth. Jonathan kneeled and placed the tulips gently at the base of the stone, brushing a few fallen leaves away with the edge of his hand. The cold from the ground seeped through his trousers, grounding him in the uncomfortable reality he always tried to push away. "Hey, Isa," he whispered, barely recognizing the sound of his own voice. "It's me. Again." The silence felt sacred here. He didn't speak for a while. He didn't have to. The conversations he shared with her had long outlived her voice. They echoed in his mind, the memory of her laughter in a narrow bookstore aisle, the way she used to trace his jawline with paint-stained fingers, her half-mocking, half-loving scold. "You're not a building, Jonathan. You're not supposed to be made of concrete." She had always seen through him, past the ambition, past the tailored suits and real estate forecasts. Isabel was the only person who'd ever known him when he still had empty pockets and dreams held together with stubborn resolve. They met in San Francisco. He had just landed an internship at a small but promising real estate firm. She was fresh out of art school, working in a bohemian bookstore cafe in the Mission District, sketching strangers between espresso orders and quoting Frida Kahlo like scripture. He walked in looking for a business magazine and walked out an hour later with a sketch of his profile she'd scribbled on a napkin. Their love was mismatched but magnetic. She brought warmth into his world of metrics. She forced him to take walks, to breathe, to see color. But love, as Jonathan had learned, wasn't always enough to outrun who you were. And he was ambitious. He had accepted a major job offer in New York, promising her they'd figure it out long distance. They didn't. She didn't follow him, and he hadn't fought as hard as he should have. The call slowed, then stopped. And when he finally realized what he'd lost, she was gone. No trace. Vanished like mist. He had hired investigators, tried mutual friends, sent letters into silence. But Isabel Rivera had become a ghost until 5 years ago, when he'd found her name etched into this stone, quietly buried with no fanfare, no obituary, no goodbye. It broke him in ways he hadn't expected. Not publicly, of course. The world still saw the empire builder, the headline maker, the man who turned old neighborhoods into luxury skylines. But inside, something had fractured and never fully healed. Jonathan reached forward and ran his hand along the edge of the headstone, fingers tracing each letter of her name. "You'd hate how sterile my office is," he said softly. "No color, no plants. You'd hang one of your ridiculous abstract paintings just to annoy me." He smiled, despite himself. The ache hadn't dulled. It had simply grown familiar. He sat back, letting the morning seep into his bones. Overhead, the sky was starting to break apart, patches of sunlight pressing through the clouds. For a moment, he closed his eyes and let himself imagine that somewhere, somehow she was listening. "I never loved anyone after you," he said. "Not really. I tried, but they didn't shake me the way you did." A few moments passed before he stood. He exhaled deeply, brushing off the back of his coat. Then out of the corner of his eye, he noticed movement. A figure standing about, 20 feet away, near the edge of the trees. Jonathan turned slightly, surprised to see someone else in this section of the cemetery. He had always come alone. That was the unspoken rule. The young man had his hands in the pockets of a weathered leather jacket. His dark curls fell slightly over his brow, and his face was partially obscured by shadow. But he wasn't just wandering. He was looking at Isabel's grave. Jonathan's instincts kicked in, the same ones that helped him size up a room in seconds. This wasn't random. He stepped forward cautiously. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice even. "Did you know her?" The young man's head turned slowly. Their eyes met, and in that instant, Jonathan felt something odd, like staring at a photograph that you didn't remember taking, but couldn't deny was yours. "Yes," the young man said, his voice rough but composed. "She was my mother." Jonathan blinked. He wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "She was my mother," he repeated. Then, after a beat that felt like it stretched for miles, "And if what she told me was true, then you're my father." Everything inside Jonathan stopped. The cemetery, the sky, the stone beneath his feet. And for the first time in decades, he felt like the ground was no longer solid. He had a son, and he had never known. Jonathan Blackwell had been blindsided before. Markets crashed, competitors betrayed, empires he built, from blueprints and steel sometimes slipped through his fingers. But nothing had ever landed with such devastating, intimate force as the words he had just heard. "She was my mother, and if what she told me is true, then you're my father." The young man's voice lingered in the air like the aftershock of an earthquake. Jonathan stood completely still, unable to trust his own breath. His mind raced through 2 decades of silence, of wondering, of not knowing. His heart, typically armored and methodical, beat fast, uneven. It was as though the past had returned not as memory but as flesh. He took a small step closer, his voice softer now, raw. "Your mother, Isabel. Are you saying she had a child? My child?" The young man's jaw clenched. "Yes, she had me." Jonathan stared at him, seeing pieces of her in every inch of his face. The angle of the cheekbones, the defiance in the eyes. But there were hints of himself too. His own sharp chin, the exact same furrow in the brow that appeared whenever he was forced to confront something that didn't fit into his carefully ordered world. "I had no idea," Jonathan said, the words falling from his mouth like confessions. "She never told me." "She didn't owe you anything," the young man replied sharply, his tone edged in pain. "You left, you chose your world. She stayed behind and built hers around me. Alone." Jonathan felt his chest cave inward, the breath he'd been holding, escaping as a silent exhale. "I didn't leave to abandon her. I left for a job, an opportunity I thought would make our lives better." The young man gave a bitter smile. "You thought wrong." A silence settled between them, not peaceful but full of restrained emotion. Jonathan reached into the depths of his memory, grasping for any sign he might have missed, any clue Isabel might have given him. But there had been nothing. She had disappeared without a trace, and now he knew why. She hadn't just left him. She had protected a life he never even knew he helped create. "What's your name?" Jonathan asked gently. The young man paused, visibly weighing whether to share something so personal. Then finally, "Lucas. Lucas Rivera." Jonathan repeated the name under his breath, testing the feel of it. Lucas. His son. A stranger. A mirror of what might have been. "How old are you?" Jonathan asked. 23. 23. She must have been pregnant when she left. Jonathan's knees weakened as the realization hit. He hadn't just lost Isabel. He had missed the birth of his son, his first words, his first steps. 23 years of milestones, scraped knees, science fairs, birthdays, heartbreaks. Gone. Lost in the quiet space between ambition and consequence. "I don't know what to say," Jonathan admitted, voice tight. "I've spent years thinking. She chose to vanish. I never imagined that she had you." Lucas crossed his arms. "That's convenient." "No," Jonathan said, stepping forward. "It's not convenient, it's hell. And I would have been there if I had known, if she had told me." "She didn't want to burden you," Lucas snapped. "You were building empires. What would you have done with a crying infant and a woman who had nothing to offer but oil paints and hope?" Jonathan recoiled, because it wasn't entirely wrong. Back then he might have resented the interruption, justified it as a distraction. That version of him, the younger man so obsessed with proving his worth to the world, had not been ready. But he wasn't that man anymore. "She had everything I needed," Jonathan said. "I just didn't know it until she was gone." Lucas looked away, blinking rapidly. His silence said more than his words could. Jonathan knew what lived in that pause. Disappointment that had hardened into survival. A life shaped by struggle that he had been shielded from. Not by chance, but by Isabel. "I'm not asking for anything," Jonathan said. "Not forgiveness, not a relationship. I know I have no right to expect that, but I want you to know, I'm here. If you want answers, if you ever want to talk, I'll listen." No expectations. Lucas let out a breath that sounded more like a release than a response. "You don't get to just show up with tulips and rewrite history. I'm not trying to rewrite it," Jonathan said, voice steady now. "But maybe we can start a new page, even if it's blank right now." The cemetery was quiet around them, only the occasional chirp of birds in the distance. The leaves rustled above, casting shifting shadows over Isabel's grave. She had brought them together in death in a way life never allowed. Jonathan looked down at her headstone, realizing it was no longer just about grief. It was about redemption. Lucas turned, beginning to walk away. "I don't know if I want anything from you." Jonathan didn't chase him. Instead, he called after him, his voice low but clear. "Whether you want anything or not, Lucas, you have me. I missed everything already. I won't miss the chance to try." Lucas paused for a fraction of a second, then kept walking, his silhouette growing smaller with each step. Jonathan stood there watching until he disappeared beyond the tree line, the echo of his footsteps fading into the distance. For a long time, Jonathan remained motionless. The tulips trembled slightly in the breeze, resting quietly against the stone. The weight of lost time settled like a stone in his chest. He had built towers that touched the sky, but he had missed the chance to be a father. Now, standing in the shadow of everything he had lost, he knew one thing with certainty. He had to find Lucas again. Not to erase the past, but to finally, truly begin. The world hadn't slowed down, but Jonathan Blackwell had. For the first time in decades, he found himself in a state he didn't quite recognize. Stillness. He wasn't drafting deals or inspecting blueprints or fielding calls from investors. He was staring out the vast glass windows of his penthouse office, watching the sun descend behind the Los Angeles skyline, the horizon awash in fire and gold. And all he could think about was a 23-year-old man who looked at him like he was a stranger and yet carried the same blood in his veins. Lucas. The name repeated itself in Jonathan's mind like a hymn, both a promise and a punishment. His son. Not in theory, not in the abstract, but in the flesh. And he hadn't known. He hadn't known Isabel was carrying their child when she walked out of his life. He hadn't known that she'd been building a world of her own while he was building skyscrapers. But now he did. And the knowledge burned. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he had once used sparingly, only for matters that required discretion and urgency. Robert Landon answered on the second ring. "Jonathan," the private investigator said. "What's happening?" "I need you to find someone," Jonathan said quietly, barely trusting the steadiness in his own voice. "His name is Lucas Rivera. He's 23, lives somewhere in San Diego, I think. His mother was Isabel Rivera." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a slow, deliberate acknowledgement. "I'll get back to you in 24 hours. The line went dead, and Jonathan sank into his chair, feeling more helpless than he had in his entire life. He had access to the finest minds, the best consultants, and every tool at his disposal. But when it came to Lucas, all he could do was wait. The next day, Robert delivered. Lucas Rivera lived in a modest apartment complex in North Park, San Diego. He worked part-time at a garage on El Cajon Boulevard and was a student at Mesa College, studying mechanical engineering. His grades were excellent. No criminal record, no flags. Just a quiet life, self-made. Jonathan held the file in his hands for a long time before opening it. Inside was a photograph. Lucas bent over an engine, grease smeared on his forearm, hair pulled back, lips set in concentration. It was an image of resilience, of work, of character, and it stung. He had missed everything. Without hesitation, Jonathan got in his car and made the drive himself. The neighborhood was a far cry from the world he lived in. The building was aging but not neglected. The sidewalk cracked, the stairs rusted, but it was real, lived in, honest in a way money couldn't polish. Jonathan climbed the stairs to the second floor, stopped at apartment 2B, and knocked. For a long moment, there was no answer. Then the door creaked open and Lucas stood there, shirt wrinkled, brow furrowed, his posture guarded. "What are you doing here?" he asked. Jonathan took a step back. "I know I should have called. I wanted to talk. Just for a moment, please." Lucas hesitated. then reluctantly opened the door wider. "You've got 5 minutes." The apartment was small, sparsely decorated. A futon, a desk with textbooks stacked high, coffee mugs, half washed in the sink. On one wall, a framed photo. Isabel and a toddler version of Lucas, both smiling at the ocean. Jonathan's eyes lingered on the photo, his throat tightening. That was her favorite place, Venice Beach. Lucas didn't respond, just sat down. At the desk, arms folded across his chest. Jonathan remained standing. He wasn't sure he had earned the right to sit. "I didn't come here to justify myself," he began carefully. "Or to fix anything. I know I can't, but I need to tell you what happened. At least from my side." Lucas nodded once, slowly. "Then talk," and Jonathan did. He spoke of Isabel, how they met, how they loved. He spoke of the decisions he made, the job that pulled him east, the conversations that dwindled, the silence that eventually consumed everything. He admitted his failures, every single one of them. And he told Lucas the truth, that he had looked for her but never found her, that by the time he did, it was too late. Lucas listened, but his expression didn't soften. "She never mentioned your name until I was about 13, he said after a long pause. "By then I didn't ask. I figured if you were gone, it was for a reason." "I was young," Jonathan said, "but not young enough to be that blind. I thought I had time. I thought I could come back and pick up where we left off." Lucas gave a dry, bitter laugh. "That's not how life works. She was sick, you know, for years. She wouldn't let me tell anyone. Said she didn't want pity." Jonathan's heart twisted. Why didn't she reach out to me? Why not let me help? "Because she didn't want help," Lucas snapped. "She wanted a partner. She wanted someone who chose her when it was hard, not after the lights went out." Silence fell again, heavier this time. Jonathan stepped closer, then paused. "I would have chosen her," he said. "I know that doesn't matter now, but it's true, and I would have chosen you." Lucas stood, jaw clenched, eyes glassy. "But you didn't." And Jonathan couldn't deny it. He had missed 23 years. He had no right to claim anything now. But that didn't stop him from trying. "I'm not asking for a second chance," Jonathan said. "I just want to know you, to learn who you are, even if it's only from a distance." Lucas looked at him for a long moment. Then quietly, "I don't know if I can trust you." "I understand," Jonathan said. "But if trust can start anywhere, maybe it's here." Lucas walked him to the door. As Jonathan stepped out into the fading light of day, Lucas spoke again, his voice more weary than angry. "I'm not saying yes, but I'm not saying no either." Jonathan nodded, holding on to that small crack in the door like it was daylight breaking through after a long night. "Then I'll wait," he said, "however long it takes." And with that he walked away, knowing this time he would not disappear. It started not with a grand gesture, but with a message. A simple one. No flourish, no emotion. Just, "There's a place I go near campus. Coffee's decent. Tomorrow morning?" The name signed below was Lucas, and the timestamp was just after midnight. Jonathan stared at the screen for several seconds, not quite breathing. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something. He replied with one word. Yes. The cafe was unremarkable, wedged between a used bookstore and a faded laundromat. It smelled like burnt espresso and fresh paper, the kind of scent that clung to people who dreamed quietly. Jonathan arrived early, as he always did, out of habit and hope. He didn't bring gifts or platitudes. He brought himself, unsure if that was enough. Lucas arrived 5 minutes late, his expression unreadable, his presence hesitant. He wore a grey hoodie, jeans slightly frayed at the cuffs, and carried a small backpack covered in smudges of graphite and ink. His face was tired, but there was something resolute in it. They ordered coffee, black, no sugar, just how Isabel had once taken it, and sat by the window, the street outside humming with early morning traffic. Neither spoke for a moment. Then, Lucas said, "I don't do small talk well." Jonathan gave a soft, careful smile. "Neither do I." Lucas tapped a finger against his cup. "So let's not pretend. You wanted to know who I am. I'm giving you that chance. But on my terms, you listen. I speak. You don't interrupt." Jonathan nodded. "Fair." Lucas leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "I study mechanical engineering. I like systems that make sense, things that can be taken apart and rebuilt. Maybe because life didn't work that way. Machines break down, but at least they tell you why. Jonathan remained quiet, absorbing every word. I work part-time at a garage. Fix cars. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. I got a scholarship to Mesa. Took years to qualify for it. I didn't want to take loans I couldn't pay back. There was no pride in his tone, just plain fact. Lucas had learned self-sufficiency early, and now Jonathan was finally seeing the cost of that resilience. He said nothing, only nodded with genuine attention. Lucas continued, slower this time. Mom didn't talk about you. When she did, it was vague. You were someone she used to know. She never trashed you. She just skipped over you. I filled in the blanks. Jonathan's voice was quiet. And what did those blanks look like? Lucas gave a crooked smile. At first I imagined a hero. Then I grew up and decided you were probably a coward. Then when I saw you at the cemetery, your clothes, your car, I figured you were just another rich man who chose himself. Jonathan looked down. I was afraid that was who I'd become. But now, Lucas said, studying him. I don't. No. You don't talk like I expected. You don't make excuses. That's unexpected. That word, unexpected, held more promise than anything Jonathan had heard in weeks. They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was full of possibility, like a door left cracked open on purpose. Do you want to know? About her, Lucas asked, surprising even himself with the question. Jonathan's eyes lifted immediately. More than anything. She loved late nights, Lucas said, his voice softer. She painted under moonlight, said daylight was too judgmental. She used to put headphones over her belly when she was pregnant with me. Played jazz. She told me she could feel me kicking harder when Coltrane came on. Jonathan smiled, pained and grateful. She never stopped being magic. No, Lucas agreed. She just ran out of time. He reached into his backpack and pulled out a folded flyer. It was sun-bleached, worn at the corners. This was her studio, he said, sliding it across the table. It's closed now, but sometimes I go by. Just to remember. Jonathan unfolded it carefully. The Blue Hour, it read. A photo showed a small, vibrant space with mismatched chairs, easels, and walls covered in children's art. She taught kids there on weekends, Lucas said. Didn't charge a cent. Of course she did, Jonathan whispered. I can take you, Lucas offered quietly. If you want. Jonathan looked up at him. I'd like that. The next afternoon, they stood outside the old studio in Barrio Logan. The door was locked, the paint faded, but the spirit of the place lingered in the air. Lucas pointed out a corner wall with a sprawling mural, abstract blues and golds, a small child reaching up to touch the sky. She painted that the year before she died, Lucas said. Said it was about chasing hope. Jonathan stepped closer. The mural was cracked, worn by time, but still beautiful. Still trying. He turned to Lucas, who was watching him carefully, and said, This is her legacy. Lucas shrugged. Part of it. Jonathan met his eyes. What's the other part? You. Lucas didn't answer immediately. Then, you're not there yet, but you're not absent anymore. That's something. It was more than something. It was a foothold, a beginning. They walked the neighborhood for a while, not talking about anything in particular. At one point, Lucas pointed out a taco stand that made the best lengua in the county. Jonathan ordered 2. They ate on a curb like teenagers. And it was the most honest meal Jonathan had shared in years. That night when they parted ways, Lucas said, This doesn't mean everything's fixed. Jonathan replied, I wouldn't trust it if it did. Lucas gave the smallest nod, then walked away. Jonathan watched until he disappeared around the corner. Later, back in his penthouse, Jonathan stood by the window, his city glowing beneath him, and realized he hadn't thought about numbers all day. He hadn't thought about investors, buildings, or deals. He had thought about a son, a boy who spoke with edge and fire, a young man who had every reason to turn away but hadn't, one coffee at a time. That was how it would happen, and Jonathan was ready. The invitation came with the kind of hesitation that couldn't be captured in words. It was a text from Jonathan, brief but deliberate. Dinner at my place. Just the 2 of us. No pressure. Lucas stared at it for almost 10 minutes before replying, and even then his answer, okay, was cautious, the word itself leaning more toward curiosity than agreement. When Friday evening arrived, Lucas stood outside the tall iron gate leading to Jonathan's hillside home in Pacific Palisades. The house loomed in the background, its lights warm against the falling dusk. It was the kind of place that belonged to men who owned power, not to those who questioned it. But tonight, Lucas wasn't there to inspect real estate. He was stepping inside something far more fragile than marble floors and ocean views. Jonathan opened the door in rolled-up sleeves and bare feet, the smell of garlic and roasted tomatoes escaping into the night. "You actually cooked?" Lucas asked, half amused, half suspicious. Jonathan smiled. "I had help. But yes, it's real food. Nothing catered, no staff." Lucas followed him inside, surprised by how lived-in the house felt. It was modern, yes, but softened by unexpected warmth, photos tucked between books on the shelves, a canvas that looked half-finished in the corner of the study, and a soft jazz record spinning somewhere in the background. He didn't know what he expected, but it wasn't this. They ate in the kitchen instead of the dining room. The table was small, wooden, clearly used. Lucas picked at the edge of his napkin before finally speaking. "You didn't have to do this." Jonathan took a sip of wine. "I wanted to. You've given me more time than I deserve. A meal seems like the least I can offer." Lucas nodded but didn't reply. Halfway through dinner, Jonathan leaned forward. "Have you thought about what comes next after school?" Lucas tilted his head. "You mean besides student debt and job hunting?" Jonathan smiled. "No pressure. I just meant you're sharp. You think in systems. You care about detail. Have you ever considered working with me? At the firm?" Lucas blinked, surprised. "You want me to intern for you?" "I want to offer you a door," Jonathan said. "You decide whether to open it." Lucas chewed that over for a while, staring at his plate. "I don't want to be some story you tell at the next board meeting. Look at my son, the engineer. That's not what this is, right?" Jonathan's voice was steady. "This is about seeing something in you. Something worth investing in." "And if I screw up?" Lucas asked. "What happens when I can't live up to the expectations of the great Jonathan Blackwell?" "Then you learn," Jonathan said without hesitation. "Like everyone else." Lucas looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time Jonathan saw not suspicion, but a question slowly beginning to turn into trust. A few days later, Lucas started his internship. The first week was awkward. People stared. Whispers followed him down hallways. "That's the CEO's kid," some said. "Didn't know he had one," others murmured. But Lucas kept his head down, ignored the curiosity, and did the work. He asked good questions, showed up early, never leaned on his name. By the second week, the whispers shifted. "He's not just here for show," someone said in the break room. "He's actually got ideas." Jonathan kept his distance professionally. He never hovered, never gave Lucas more attention than the others. But he listened, always. And when one of Lucas's project proposals was praised by a senior architect, Jonathan didn't say a word in the meeting. Only after, when they crossed paths near the elevator, did he quietly say, "That was good work." Lucas nodded, but the pride in his eyes said more than his silence ever could. Outside of work, their relationship began to take a new shape. They met for dinners at quiet places. They walked along the beach. They laughed occasionally, even over nothing. But it was during one of those walks that Lucas brought up something unexpected. "I've been thinking of going to Sedona," he said. Jonathan looked at him. "Why there?" "Mom used to talk about it," Lucas said. "Said she always wanted to see the red rocks and feel the stillness. I guess it was one of the places she never made it to." Jonathan didn't speak at first. Then with measured calm he said, "Let's go together." They left 2 weeks later, driving rather than flying. Jonathan offered to charter a flight, but Lucas declined. "If we're going to do this, let's do it slow," he'd said. The road gave them time to talk about everything and nothing. Lucas shared childhood stories. Jonathan admitted to mistakes he'd made, business decisions that cost him sleep. They listened to music. They sat in silence. And for the first time, the silence wasn't heavy. In Sedona, they hiked up Cathedral Rock at sunrise. Lucas carried a small velvet pouch in his backpack. When they reached the ridge, he opened it and pulled out a scattering of Isabel's ashes. "I brought her," he said. "She never saw this place, but I thought maybe she'd like to rest here." Jonathan didn't speak. He only nodded. Lucas walked to the edge and released the ashes into the wind. They lifted easily, catching the light swirling above them, like breath. She always believed people could change, Lucas said quietly. She just didn't wait around to see if they would, Jonathan whispered. She changed me, even after she was gone. They stood there for a long time side by side, staring into the horizon where the sun burned against the red stone. That evening, back in their hotel, Lucas pulled a journal from his bag. It was hers, he said. She wrote in it during chemo. I haven't read it all, but there's something in here you should see. He flipped to a page and handed it over. Jonathan read the inked words, his hands trembling. If he ever finds you, tell him I forgive him. But more than that, tell him it's not too late for either of you. Jonathan closed the journal, eyes burning. She left that for us, Lucas said. Jonathan nodded. And I won't waste it. The next morning, as they drove back through the desert, Lucas looked out the window and said, almost offhandedly, You were right about the internship. I like being part of something that builds. Jonathan glanced at him and smiled. So do I. And they drove on, the road ahead clear, the past behind them, still there but no longer in control. It was no longer about blood, it was about choice, and they were choosing each other. Autumn in Los Angeles felt different now, not because the air had changed, but because Jonathan Blackwell had. A year had passed since the day he first met Lucas at Isabel's grave. That encounter had shattered everything he thought he knew about his past, but it had also offered something more fragile and infinitely more valuable. A future. Jonathan stood in the office overlooking the city he had helped shape. From this height, the world looked ordered, neat, but he knew now that life didn't obey blueprints. It unfolded in unexpected ways, like discovering a son he never knew, like learning how to be a father not in the first breath of birth, but in the long, steady rhythm of time earned. Lucas was no longer just a visitor in his life. He had become part of it, in real, everyday ways. He now occupied an office 2 floors below, where he was quietly building his own path. Not in Jonathan's shadow, but in parallel. His internship had turned into a position in the firm's sustainability division. His ideas, bold, data-driven, unapologetically idealistic, had begun shaping projects. Jonathan had watched from a respectful distance as Lucas earned respect, not because of his last name, but because of how he carried himself, his decisions, his ethic. The young man had grit, but he also had vision, and something else, a sense of integrity that reminded Jonathan of Isabel in ways that surprised and humbled him. Their personal bond grew in the spaces between work. Not in forced declarations or long-winded heart-to-hearts, but in shared rituals. Sunday dinners in the kitchen, jazz on vinyl, walks through Central Park when they traveled to New York for firm expansion talks. They moved toward each other like men building something without blueprints, slowly, layer by layer. One evening, after a long day at the office, Jonathan looked up to find Lucas at his door. You have a minute? Lucas asked. Jonathan gestured to the chair across from his desk. Always. Lucas sat quieter than usual. There was a tension in his shoulders that Jonathan hadn't seen in months. I've been thinking about her again, Lucas said. Jonathan didn't need to ask who. I keep wondering what she would say if she saw all of this now, Lucas continued. You and me, working together, talking like we're figuring this out. Jonathan let that sit between them before answering. She'd be proud of you. Lucas nodded. And you? Jonathan paused. Then, she'd be relieved that I finally stopped living for what I could build and started living for who I could be. Lucas pulled something from his messenger bag. A small box tied with a ribbon. I found this going through some of her old things. I thought you should have it. Jonathan took the box carefully, untied the ribbon, and opened the lid. Inside was a Polaroid, faded and cracked. Isabel in a sundress, holding a baby, Lucas on a rooftop with the skyline behind them. The joy on her face was radiant, and though Jonathan wasn't in the picture, he felt present. The photo felt like permission, a silent reminder that even in her absence, Isabel had found a way to bridge the divide between past and future. She never hated you, Lucas said softly. Even when she was sick. She didn't talk about it much, but when she did, she always said you had a good heart, just a lost one. Jonathan blinked back the sharp sting in his eyes. She gave me more grace than I deserved. Lucas leaned back in his chair. None of us deserve it. That's why it means something. Jonathan set the photo on his desk beside a framed image of a cityscape he and Lucas had recently co-designed, a low-income housing complex in Boyle Heights, built with recycled materials, solar panels, and artistic murals. One of Lucas's ideas. One of many. I was thinking, Jonathan said, about the future. You've been leading the sustainability team, but your role's outgrowing your title. How would you feel about stepping into a partner position? Lucas's brow lifted. As in co-lead? As in co-CEO, Jonathan said. Eventually, when you're ready. Lucas didn't speak for a moment. Then he smiled, not wide but honest. You think I'm ready? I think you were ready the moment you walked into my life and told me the truth, Jonathan replied. The rest has just been you proving it to yourself. Lucas's expression turned thoughtful. I'd want to do things differently. I'd expect nothing less. He stood offering his hand. Lucas shook it, firm and steady. They didn't need more words. The following weekend, Lucas invited Jonathan over to dinner. Not at the penthouse, but at his own modest apartment in Silver Lake. The living room was small, cluttered with blueprints, sketches, and a sleepy dog named Harvey that Jonathan had helped adopt from a rescue. Lucas cooked. It wasn't gourmet, but it was good. Real. As they sat eating on mismatched chairs, Lucas glanced at the door. There's someone I want you to meet, he said. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. She's important, Lucas said. Her name's Lena. When she walked in, bright-eyed and smiling, Jonathan's breath caught. Not because she looked like Isabel. She didn't. But because she carried that same quiet confidence. That same light. And the way she looked at Lucas told Jonathan everything he needed to know. After dinner, as Lena and Lucas cleared the plates, Jonathan sat back and watched the scene unfold. The laughter, the ease, the life. Later, as he stepped outside into the cool night, Lucas joined him on the porch. This is what she wanted for you, Jonathan said, gazing at the stars. Not the wealth or the reputation. Just this, a life that matters. Lucas didn't reply. He just stood next to him, shoulders almost touching. You've given me more than I could have imagined, Jonathan added. Not just forgiveness, but a reason to become someone better. You did that yourself, Lucas said. I just didn't stop you. They stood in silence for a long time. And in that silence, Jonathan understood something fundamental. Family wasn't defined by blood. It wasn't forged in the delivery room or measured by shared DNA. It was chosen. Piece by piece, in the hard conversations, the honest moments, the grace given when it wasn't earned. He hadn't been there for Lucas's first steps, but he'd be there for every step moving forward. Second chance wasn't just a gift, it was a responsibility, and he would never waste it. In the quiet unfolding of Jonathan and Lucas's journey, we are reminded that the most powerful stories often grow from pain, silence, and the courage to reconnect. This is not just a story about a millionaire discovering a son he never knew. It's a story about humility, redemption, and the deep human longing to be seen, known, and forgiven. It teaches us that time once lost cannot be reclaimed, but relationships can still be rebuilt if we choose presence over pride and effort over excuses. Lucas's guarded strength and Jonathan's hard-earned vulnerability reveal that family isn't always given. Sometimes it's chosen, built through trust, one conversation, one coffee, one act of love at a time. We all carry broken pieces, but when we share them honestly, they can form something whole. This story reminds us that it's never too late to reach out, to make amends, and to live a life that matters, not through achievements, but through the people we hold close. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, please subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep sharing stories that heal, uplift, and remind us of what truly matters. Let's keep building meaningful moments together.